momento em Edimburgo. É um grande prazer recebê-la, professora Raquel. E eu gostaria imediatamente de agradecer a sua disponibilidade em nome da Cátedra Unesco em Políticas Linguísticas para o Multilinguismo, que eu tenho o prazer de dirigir aqui na nossa universidade, e da qual faz parte também a Mylene Franklin. Agradeço em nome da cátedra, que está funcionando desde 2018 e que tem justamente na tradução e interpretação uma das suas vertentes mais importantes. São 7 eixos que orientam o trabalho de relação com o multilinguismo: internacionalização, novas tecnologias de comunicação e informação, tradução e acessibilidade, direitos linguísticos, muito oportuno aqui na sua fala, economia e econometria linguísticas, migração, diásporas, fronteiras, e também questões relacionadas a literaturas multilingües, cada vez mais comuns também nos estudos de tradução. A cátedra é uma rede de pesquisa que envolve, nesse momento, 35 universidades em 17 países, sobretudo países do sul global, que funcionam, pesquisam e ensinam em 11 línguas diferentes, o que é uma experiência em si mesma muito interessante, já que um número reduzido de línguas é usado nas universidades do mundo, apenas cerca de 80 línguas são usadas no ensino superior no mundo, 1% de todas as línguas estão no ensino superior, e nós temos aqui 15% desse 1% de línguas usadas no ensino superior. Na cátedra, há vários grupos trabalhando com tradução e interpretação em regimes de línguas minoritárias, minorizadas, em que ressalta-se a importância da concepção de direito linguístico, e, nesse sentido, a sua palestra virá também a suprir uma série de discussões que temos feito nesse âmbito. Então, eu gostaria de agradecer muito a sua presença e disponibilidade. Gostaria de agradecer muito a Mylene também, que tem nos propiciado, com a organização dos eventos, uma fonte muito importante de reflexão para as teses que estão em andamento, para as pesquisas que a universidade tem realizado. E desejo, então, uma ótima palestra a todos, e à professora Raquel, novamente os nossos agradecimentos, e que seja para você também uma boa experiência. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada, professor Gilvan. Então, queria iniciar dizendo que é uma honra, em nome da Cátedra Unesco de Políticas Linguísticas para o Multilinguismo e para a pós-graduação do estudo da tradução da UFSC, apresentar hoje a professora Raquel de Pedro Ricoy, titular de Tradução e Interpretação na Universidade de Stirling, na Escócia. Ao longo de sua carreira acadêmica, ela se dedica ao treinamento de tradutores e intérpretes, além de atuar como tradutora, intérprete e lexógrafa. Ela foi professora visitante das universidades de Bolonha, na Itália, Havana, em Cuba, e na Pontífica Universidade Católica do Peru. Entre 2014 e 2016, ela foi co-investigadora em um projeto que pesquisou o papel dos tradutores e intérpretes indígenas treinados pelo Estado na mediação de direitos indígenas no Peru contemporâneo. E entre 2018 e 2019, liderou um projeto sobre o papel de intérpretes indígenas não treinados no acesso aos direitos humanos para mulheres indígenas peruanas na região andina. Seu interesse de pesquisa inclui as dimensões sociais e culturais da tradução e interpretação, em especial em contextos de serviços públicos que envolvem comunidades minoritárias e a tradução de textos multimodais. Atualmente, ela se concentra na mediação linguística e cultural, na defesa dos direitos humanos, políticas linguísticas, construção e manutenção de confiança e comunicação global. Raquel de Pedro Ricoy tem publicações e apresentações sobre esses temas na Europa, América e Ásia. O tema de sua palestra de hoje é There's no word for rights in my language, translation and interpreting in post-colonial context. Não existem palavras para direitos na minha língua, tradução e interpretação em contextos pós-coloniais. Agradecemos também a presença dos intérpretes de Libras, da Coordenadoria de Tradutores e Intérpretes do CCE, da UFSC, a Bárbara, Camila e a Fernanda, e aos intérpretes ex-alunos da Interpret2B, Daniel Rosa e Gabriela Birdman. Eu também queria agradecer a professora Silvana Santos, que por motivos técnicos ainda não conseguiu chegar, mas que também está na coordenação desse evento. Raquel, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Obrigada. It is an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be here with you today. Not here, but here in cyberspace. And I am really grateful to the organizers for having invited me and giving me the opportunity to participate in this forum. Thanks also to the interpreters, of course, and apologies for my voice because I've got a really bad cold. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation now, hopefully, and then we'll start the proceedings. Hang on. I don't know whether you can see this. You just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down.
Yes, I can.
You can. Okay, fantastic. Yes. Okay, so just going to start the presentation itself. Okay, so thanks, Mylene, for all your help with the organization of this event and the flawless communication with me. And you've done a good part of my job already because you've explained my background and where this is coming from. Between 2014 and 2019, alongside Rosalind Howard from the University of Newcastle and Luis Andrade Ciudad from the Pontificia Universidad Católica del Perú, conducted research into indigenous rights in the context of language policy, linguistic policies, and translation and interpreting, which is, of course, the area that I specialize in. And I chose the title for this webinar, not only because it may shock some people, but also because there is no word for rights in my language, has very deep implications, not just in terms of translation, which of course it does, it questions notions of equivalence, of linguistic asymmetries, and it makes us reflect on how cross-cultural communication is conducted or can be conducted. Just brief context for this. You may already know this. Peru, a very large country, not compared to Brazil, but in general, a large country with a very low population density, and 48 indigenous languages, and Peruvian Sign Language, coexisting with, of course, the hegemonic language, Spanish. Spanish has official status across the Peruvian state. The indigenous languages have official status in the areas where they predominate. Of course, this leads to policy planning, policy implementation in terms of how you can cater for such a diverse country in terms of languages and cultures. Of course, when we talk about rights, what rights? There is a plethora of international legislation, starting from the human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the ILO Convention number 169, the language rights, Barcelona Declaration of Rights in 1996, which was supported by United Nations, but it was not ratified. And then we've got this concept of linguistic human rights, which are at the intersection of language rights and human rights. Of course, in different countries, particularly in the 21st century in Latin America, domestic legislation, if it didn't exist before, started to be implemented to address the communicative needs of the minority communities or minoritized communities, depending on how we look at it. And this was the case in Peru. So in Peru, from 1993, the right to translation and interpreting services between Spanish and indigenous languages was recognized. In 2005, there was a law of originary languages, indigenous languages, that was enacted. And again, it recognized the linguistic rights of the indigenous communities and the right to have the services of interpreters and translators to communicate with the state institutions in public service provision. So obviously, mainly health and law. Okay, so this legislation was in place from the early 1990s. However, as we all know, there is a difference between language planning and language implementation. There was no real implementation of those rights for a very simple reason. There were not officially qualified interpreters who could work between the indigenous languages and Spanish. So the situation never arose. Apparently, of course, it would have arisen, but there was no actual implementation of language policy to uphold indigenous rights. There was a turning point in 2011 when two key pieces of legislation were implemented and enacted, and one was a second Language of Originary Languages Act, and the other one was the Right to Prior Consultation Act. So we can ask ourselves, okay, what happened? Why all of a sudden the state institutions, and we collaborated with the Directorate for Indigenous Languages, which is part of the Vice Ministry for Intercultural Affairs in Peru during the projects. And we also collaborated with an NGO called Asociación Servicios Educativos Rurales. And in fact, the title for this webinar is taken from the words of a colleague at Asociación Servicios Educativos Rurales, who was really puzzled as to how they could best socialize the rights as enshrined in the legislation in the communities, when in some languages there is no word for rights, or it is derived from Spanish. So it's about how this was conceptualized. Therefore, the Peruvian Ministry of Culture, through the Directorate for Indigenous Languages, designed a training program for indigenous interpreters. The training program is an intensive 3-week course. It's not language specific, and it aims at creating a register, which was again approved in 2016 for indigenous interpreters and translators working between Spanish and ideally, all the indigenous languages in Peru. Now, obviously, this is, a very commendable effort, and it is also commendable that they're trying to get a balance between male and female interpreters, and I'll get back to this in a few minutes, to cater for the needs of the indigenous population. So we can ask ourselves, why all of a sudden, what happened to effect this change in policy implementation? And what happened in Bagua on the 5th of June in 2009 was this. Okay, and this was the culmination of an escalation of tension and hostilities, because the government at the time introduced domestic legislation that aimed to simplify procedures for trading communal lands in Amazonian territories. Obviously, trading communal lands for, more often than not, extractive purposes, oil and gas, and in the same way as minerals in the Andean regions. This was obviously a very traumatic episode in Peruvian history. Hundreds of people were injured. The death toll was quite high. And there had to be trials because criminal charges were filed against 53 civilians, a mixture of indigenous and mestizo, and against 3 police officers. Now, by law, the presence of interpreters was required. As you can imagine, this was no easy endeavor. 2 of the interpreters who had been, trained and documented in the sense of being part of the register as legitimate interpreters for public services, took part in the trials. Excuse me. Now, obviously a very controversial, very turbulent set of trials. The interpreters, and some of you will know, amazed to hear this, came under a lot of scrutiny and a lot of criticism. They were not legal experts. The proceedings had to be stopped so that the judiciary could actually instruct them in what some terms meant and what they didn't mean. And they were accused of not providing simultaneous interpreting, which according to some groups is the international standard in trials. Of course it's not, but that's what they were coming up against. So one of them was female, and she was a speaker of One Piece, and the other one was male, and he is a speaker of Awahun, although the female interpreter speaks both languages. Now, when the trials ended in September 2016, the 53 civilians were acquitted of all charges. This was actually quite controversial because of the number of deaths, the number of injuries, and so on and so forth. But in Peru, and I will be talking a bit more about this in a minute as well, there is a system which is called the intercultural justice system, which has to be applied even when the trials or any proceedings take place under the state legal framework, which obviously derives from Roman law, whereas the communities are ruled by very different, use and customs, sort of common laws. Interestingly, the trial against the police officers is yet to start. So we don't know what will happen with that in terms of interpretation or no interpretation. Now, the Directorate for Indigenous Languages in Peru created a series of specialized workshops as a follow-on to the 3-week intensive course training Indigenous interpreters. So one on health, another one in law, another one in prior consultation more specifically. I am going to deal with all those scenarios in turn. We take the Bawa trials. This is a photo that was taken during the proceedings. And the interpreters, as I said, found it quite difficult. We interviewed them, and they've given interviews to BBC Mundo as well. The issue that everybody was focusing on, which was this lack of equivalence between words or concepts, was overshadowed by the fact that the differences between the legal systems were substantial. So as we know, what is considered a crime or an offense under a particular framework is not considered that under another. And that was the crux of the matter. We know the idea of ignorance of the law does not exempt you from following it. But this became really, really controversial, and interpreters played a crucial role in making this possible. Now, I know that time is short, so I'm going to move on to another example taken from the health contexts in Peru under the new linguistic, not so new now, but linguistic policy implementation. And this case comes from, again, another very tragic episode in Peruvian history of forced sterilizations. In 1995, the government launched the Reproductive Health and Family Planning Program with the idea that if birth rates went down, poverty would go down as well. Now, whatever you may think of that, the end result was that nearly 315,000 women, most of them indigenous, were subjected to sterilizations. According to the Latin American and Caribbean Commission for the Rights of Women, CLADEM, only 10% of them gave their consent. The focus was very much on the women because some men were also sterilized, but they were in a minority. However, the Peruvian office of the Ombudsman, the Defensoría del Pueblo, investigated the matters and published 3 reports that were highlighting some of the flaws in the process, the absence of guarantees for informed consent, the undue pressure that women were put under, and the lack of aftercare. We had it reported to us that all the aftercare was that if they agreed to be sterilized, they would give them some food to take home to their children. Imagine, under no particular sanitary conditions in remote areas, that had a huge impact on the death toll and the health of the people who are sterilized. Now, the Defensoría del Pueblo, the Office of the Ombudsman, conducted interviews regionally with the women who had been affected so that they could present their testimonies, which in turn would inform the reports, the conclusions, and the following actions. Now, a register was created, as I said, was launched in 2015 by the Ministry of Justice and Human Rights. And the idea was to seek legal redress for the victims. Now, I've mentioned the register before about the interpreters who can legitimately work between Spanish and indigenous languages in public services. And still there is a majority of men. And in Ayacucho, only male qualified interpreters had been recruited to assist with the compilation of testimonies for the register, because there were no available accredited registered female ones. Now, you can imagine, and we can discuss this at the end if you want, the consequences for a woman who is discussing very intimate, very traumatic episodes in front of a male interpreter. As a result, the Directorate of Indigenous Languages to the rescue, and they accredited on the spot 3 of the social interpreters. These are non-qualified, untrained, non-remunerated interpreters who are leaders in their communities, and they help other community members. And then they obviously raised the alarm that the women were being traumatized, they were very distressed. They explained that they just said yes to a question when they should have said no, and so on and so forth. Because again, it's not about linguistic equivalence, it's about how discursive patterns work and how they're interpreted and how they are used. And finally, the right to prior consultation, which, you know, ideally should be seen as an attempt at decolonization. The right to prior consultation, again enacted in 2011, means that interpreters have to be present during any negotiations between a government agency who would give a concession normally to a foreign company, but also to domestic companies, and their own rights, their own ancestral rights in the land. Again, very, very, very complex scenario, in that in some communities, and very sadly, language attrition has taken its toll. The indigenous languages are no longer spoken. However, an interpreter has to be there because it is the law. There are issues that also relate to identity, belonging, and allegiance to the communities. Because as part of the training, the interpreters think that, this is what they're taught, they have to be objective, neutral, and impartial. But if they're members of the communities, that becomes very, very different. Because they are members of the communities as well as interpreters. So this is a very, very complex scenario in which issues of trust come into place. I had people from government departments saying to me, but of course that, you know, if we speak for 2 minutes during a prior consultation process and the interpreter is still talking after 5 minutes, you cannot help but wonder what on earth is he or she saying. So it is a really good compromise, I would say, in terms of how this is dealt with. However, in the Act, again enacted in 2011, there is a paragraph that says that this is an intercultural conversation and that the aim is to reach a consensus. If a consensus cannot be reached, even through the mediation and help of interpreters, the final decision belongs to the government. Okay, right. So just to sum up, I'm coming to the end of this. Translation and interpreting can be seen as enablers of access to human rights for people who do not understand the hegemonic, majority, mainstream language in colonial, post-colonial contexts. This is problematic for a variety of reasons, but we have to consider, legislation, policy, and policy planning and implementation, but also the procedures. We have to bear in mind that exchanges between, in Peru, Spanish and the originary languages develop against the background of historic discrimination against the indigenous people, their languages, and their cultures. There's also the institutional and public perceptions of the translators and interpreters' role. Why is it necessary? Why don't the indigenous people, most of them speak some Spanish anyway, yeah? More or less in Spanish, we can understand each other. That is not necessarily true. And we were given evidence that some people were refusing the help of translators, mostly interpreters, because of the oral nature of the languages, primarily, because they were afraid that if they said that they needed an interpreter, they would be considered inferior. So again, the issue of trust is critical. Obviously, I've been focusing on a particular context here, but all this has relevance, in my view, for topics and issues as diverse as immigration, legal systems, crisis, empowerment, well-being, asylum, refugees, healthcare, communities, and so on. Okay, so this finishes my talk, and I thought that I would just present a few issues that we can discuss if you want. It's not compulsory, but some of the controversies that have been surrounding this debate may be like a useful point to kind of start a discussion. So the first one relates to the legal context. I'm going to give you time to read it, and I'm going to give the interpreters time to interpret it. Okay. Now, the right to translation and interpreting, yeah, between indigenous languages and the hegemonic language, and again, the Directorate for Indigenous Languages in Peru, as part of the Vice Ministry for Intercultural Affairs, has done a fantastic job in putting measures together that can actually facilitate this. But, some people say, why should translation and interpreting be the cornerstone of language policy? Why can't the indigenous people, the indigenous communities, indigenous populations be addressed in their own language without the need for any mediation? Again, we will have to consider linguistic and cultural asymmetries and the domination of Spanish in Peru as the only official language in the whole territory. assuming that Spanish can act as a lingua franca is a very big assumption. Again, regardless of what we think of that. And presumption of bilingualism, again, is a bit risky because some people can have some sort of, a good use of Spanish, good understanding, good expression, but in legal and health contexts that are delivered by the linguistic majority, that becomes very difficult. I mean, it becomes very difficult even if it's our own language anyway. Never mind that if you have added obstacles, it becomes even more complex. We shouldn't assume that Indigenous people are bilingual. We shouldn't assume that it is Indigenous people who must learn Spanish. So just another controversial issue to kind of just launch there. And then this notion of linguistic and cultural mediation via translation and interpreting versus monolingual communication. Again, it's not as simple as it may look because legal contexts are determined not just by the language that is used, but by the values they represent. In health settings, we have different experiences and different understandings of illness, of medical procedures, of prevention in the case of the pandemic, for instance. And in prior consultation processes, again, the tension between Indigenous population and whichever agency is facilitating development, infrastructural, or legislative projects, it is fraught with difficulties as well. Okay, and I'll just leave it there. I will stop sharing. And over to you, Mylene, if you're going to moderate this.
Ok, então as perguntas estão abertas. Quem quiser fazer uma pergunta para a professora Raquel, pode falar com ela em português. E quem quiser ouvir a professora Raquel em inglês, pode ir no canal de interpretação. Quem quiser fazer em inglês, pode também seguir e aí fazemos o contrário. Então, estão abertas as perguntas para a discussão número 1. Pode abrir a câmera também, microfone, ou levantar a mão, nós também temos em reações, se não me engano. Deixa eu ver onde está. Você pode escolher levantar a mão para a gente também ter uma ordem de falas. Sim? Tem perguntas para a professora Raquel? Também, quem não quiser abrir o microfone, pode fazer uma pergunta pelo chat, que eu posso ler para vocês.
And you don't have to ask questions if you don't want to. I just included some topics for discussion at the end. And I would be really, really interested to know what you think about all these issues. And particularly, I mean, most of you are in Brazil, but in the contexts that you are familiar with, whether these notions resonate with you, whether you have different experiences. Also, reflections from the interpreters, because I've been mentioning the role in Peru, but you're operating in a different context as well. So,
Professora Raquel, eu tenho uma pergunta. If you want, you can go to the Portuguese channel or English channel.
I've got it.
If you prefer. Como a senhora vê que a diferenciação entre direitos humanos e direitos indígenas pode influenciar no treinamento de intérpretes comunitários e também no desenvolvimento profissional dessa categoria?
Okay, thank you, Mylene. Very interesting question. I put that there because some people are saying, okay, but indigenous rights are human rights. Indigenous people are humans. Well, of course, yes. Why would they be treated differently? And I've spoken in various fora about this, and people in the global north tend to be a bit surprised that this notion of intercultural justice means that it is applied differently to mainstream society and to members of indigenous communities. Why? I mean, somebody once, this is a while back, said to me, well, justice is equal for all, or it is not justice. But, the system that applies has to make accommodations for, the reality, the lives, the lived experiences of people who are not part of mainstream society. And there are some conceptions of the law and what the law is and how it's unmovable and unchangeable and all that are expressed by some groups. But as I said, in Peru, I don't know what happens in Brazil, but there is this idea of the intercultural justice that takes into consideration differences between the populations that are part of that legal framework. Some of them are more invested in it than others for obvious reasons, for historical reasons. But it is something that is quite controversial.
Ok, Raquel, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mylene.
Mais alguém teria uma pergunta para a professora Raquel sobre o tópico 1 de discussão? Acho que eu tenho alguém com a mão levantada. Simon?
Olá, conseguem me ouvir? Tudo bem?
I can hear you perfectly.
Olá, professora Raquel, tudo bem? Ouvindo sua palestra, uma das questões que me pegou muito, eu sou tradutor e intérprete de língua de sinais brasileira, e é a questão das línguas minorizadas e essa relação de confiança, né, que você traz entre a população indígena e os intérpretes, e que é algo que eu acho que é muito comum quando se fala de tradutores e de intérpretes vivenciando populações minorizadas. Eu queria te perguntar quais estratégias ou quais possibilidades nós poderíamos, como intérpretes dessas comunidades, ter para aumentar essa relação de confiança.
Yeah, well, excellent question, Simon. Excellent question. A difficult one, because, building, maintaining, and repairing trust is very, very difficult, yeah? Particularly when we're having opposing views as to, for instance, extractive projects, let's say in the cases of consulta previa, yeah? So the strategies that I would suggest that can be useful is, or could be useful, are not so much on the ground strategies, but I would be more about briefing and debriefing, clarifying issues. What is my role and what are the limits of my role? Okay? No, not all languages are equal. It may take me longer to explain something, so don't be suspicious if I speak longer, yeah? In Peru, in a sense, it's not uncommon that the communities, for instance, in instances of prior consultation processes, it's not uncommon that as well as the interpreter who has been trained and is under the government's register, is there side by side with a local interpreter because of the issues of trust. Yeah. And obviously that is quite crucial in how you actually manage that. And perhaps preparation and, as I said, briefing and debriefing is more helpful than the actual strategies that you can adopt on the ground. Because there is a myriad, there are multiple scenarios that can arise, yeah? And again, you know, the great people at the Directorate of Indigenous Languages gave us examples on how, you know, they sent an interpreter of a particular language, and because this person was not from the community, they said, we don't understand you. We can't get a word you're saying, even though they share the language. So these are questions that, you know, the users of the services, interpreting services, and this is not just the indigenous population, because the institutions and society at large benefits from that, yeah? So that's what I mean by the users of the services, the beneficiaries of the services. I think there needs to be more information about the role of interpreters. It needs to be problematized what the notions of objectivity, neutrality, and impartiality mean. Yeah. Something very simple that I, you know, I used to tell my students was that, you know, I cannot be impartial. I've got my views, but if I'm interpreting, I will have to act like I am impartial. So, you know, let's problematize issues that are quite complex and cannot really be oversimplified. A very long answer. I don't know whether that helped, but you know.
Ótimo, ajudou muito. Muito obrigado.
Obrigada.
Obrigado.
Mais alguma pergunta para o tópico 1 da professora Raquel trouxe para discutir? Caso contrário, eu acho que ela pode seguir para o tópico 2 de 3 tópicos que ela trouxe. Raquel, eu penso que você pode ir para o tópico 2.
Okay, I mean, I don't want to force anybody. Do you want me to share the slides again?
Yes, sure. That would be
Okay.
great.
Right, okay. Okay. So, yeah, so basically this was the one about not giving the same treatment to people who are members of indigenous populations than those who are part of mainstream society. This was the idea of, you know, providing public services to indigenous people in their own languages without the need for translation or interpreting. So that has been described as the ideal horizon, but I think is actually, again, not as simple as it may look. Say, okay, yeah, so you have to basically, you know, if a doctor is practicing on a community and a Wahun community, and she or he is a speaker of Spanish, will have to learn the language, the originary language. From my point of view, that's problematic for a variety of reasons. Public servants who are monolingual Spanish, okay, they can actually, you know, learn the language, the originary language. But if they're only staying for 2 years, they may not, you know, become terribly proficient, and they may not necessarily acquire sufficient cultural knowledge as well as linguistic knowledge. Now, again, the Vice Ministry of Intercultural Affairs, through the Directorate for Indigenous Languages, they've launched an initiative which is to train bilingual civil servants or civil servants, who work in areas where the languages predominate. And that is a very positive initiative as well. But of course, we have different conceptions of, what law means and what health and healing and disease mean. And that is something that, obviously has to be as well developed, and not just for these bilingual civil servants, but also in general for the population of the areas. Another issue that I see related to that, and then you can tell me what you think, is that we should not ignore that Indigenous populations are mobile. There is a lot of mobility for personal, economic reasons. And remember that the original languages are only official in the areas where they predominate. The highest number of Quechua, native speakers of Quechua, are in Lima, they're not in Cusco. That's what I was told, according to the official figures. So what happens when those people move out of the area where the language predominates? There'll still be, this is what I think, but maybe I'm biased, there still needs to be the need for translators and interpreters. And you tell me, feel free to disagree.
De novo, as perguntas estão abertas, podem abrir o microfone. O pessoal está com fome. Vamos lá, gente, aproveitar a oportunidade.
Oops. There is a question, a very good question in the chat from Samuel dos Santos. How the courts are seeing these questions in terms of, the right to having translation interpreting services with Indigenous languages. What do I think, would be needed? It's a very good question because, again, during the pandemic, and which had a devastating effect on Indigenous communities, mainly Amazonian ones, in Peru, I mean, obviously across the world, across the region, but it was actually quite interesting because the mechanisms were all there in place. You would send interpreters, you would send people who could actually explain the measures to the communities. They created posters, radio commercials explaining things, that you should do, you should not do during the pandemic. But the reality of the communities made it quite difficult to, for instance, wash your hands with, water that is not polluted. Obviously not all Indigenous people, but some. And there was a lot of disquiet, and a lot of young people mobilized, and they provided help in terms of ancestral health and healing techniques to Amazonian communities. Some of them had a background in medicine as well, but what really shocked me when I was researching this, remotely of course, was that the emphasis was not on translators or interpreters. They wanted to be addressed directly in their own language in a culturally appropriate manner. And cultural appropriateness was key, much more so than this. Obviously, they do appreciate the right to translation interpreting services, but the information that I gathered, people were much more interested in being addressed in their own terms and in a culturally appropriate manner. Don't know whether that answers your question, Jamal. Thank you. Obrigada.
Thank you, Raquel. Mais alguma pergunta? Podemos ir para a discussão número 3.
Okay. So, again, this notion of linguistic and cultural mediation versus the value of monolingual communication, I've already touched on that, yeah. But again, in legal contexts, this would not necessarily be possible. As I mentioned before, there may be some presumption of bilingualism, but that should not determine the application of the law or the policy implementation. So, for instance, in the European Union, you know, if I were, not that I would, but if I were to commit a crime and I was tried in criminal proceedings, I could express myself in English or Spanish. I could choose. And people could say, well, okay, but then, you know, you speak both languages, so why? Yeah, it's a right. So it's something that needs to be considered in the cases of bicultural legal systems, which, you know, obviously take into consideration the needs and the sensitivities of the indigenous people in a way that they wouldn't if they were, you know, if it was mainstream society members, or, you know, mestizo members, because the mestizo population has different rights to the indigenous population. In terms of health settings, again, our colleagues who were partners in the project, and they gave us a very impactful example of how problematic disregarding information about, or knowledge about, different understandings of health, healing, treatments, and so on and so forth are. And one of them was of a woman an indigenous woman, who was very traumatized when she was taken to the hospital to give birth to her first child, because in her culture, so to go for basically vertical births, but when she got to the hospital, they removed her skirt, they pulled it over her face, they took her hat off. That is a major offense and embarrassment for a woman from that culture. And she was so traumatized by the experience that when she became pregnant again, she gave birth at home because she didn't want to go to the hospital, and sadly got an infection and died. But again, there are policies and initiatives in place that can help that, so that kind of scenario is not replicated again. And for instance, that the hospital she went to now, they do offer the possibility of a vertical birth, rather than kind of putting people on a gurney and stretchers and whatever they need to do. So there are measures in place to educate the population, as well as to not just the language, but also cultural expectations, conventions, just basically to be respectful to one another. And prior consultation processes, I mentioned it earlier on, so I will not go back into it. I see Vanessa's got a question.
Vanessa, pode abrir o seu microfone.
Hello, good afternoon, Raquel. Boa tarde, pessoal. A minha pergunta, basicamente, ela tem a ver com esse tópico do health settings. My question has to do with the health settings. that you just mentioned, Raquel. I just think about how the women, the indigenous women, can communicate, for example, to doctors, especially concerning the consultations that are specific for women, like gynecologists and that kind of stuff, and concerning the security, their security. In Brazil, for example, in some states now, it is allowed for us to get into the doctor's office with another person, like a friend or our husbands, due to prior crimes committed against us. So I would consider this their security concerning these situations.
Of course, thank you very much, Vanessa. And this, fascinating, because of course, particularly, I mean, in all walks of life, but in health settings, you should be able to expect to be safe and protected. Again, just going back to this business of it's not just about the language transfer or whatever. It's about looking more holistically at the situation. Again, as part of our research, we found that in Peru, and it's not, I mean, I'm not saying that people are doing this deliberately, it's just probably that they don't know better. But unlike in the global north, where there are regulations in a lot of countries, whereby a family member, a child, a hospital porter cannot act as an interpreter formally. Yeah, you have to get a public service interpreter who is qualified to do the job. Yeah, this goes back to questions of trust. And then we think, okay, we need to get somebody who's actually qualified, who knows what they're doing, rather than this person's son interpreting between the surgeon pre-operation, yeah, and the patient. However, we had our, as part of the second project, where, when we worked with untrained, unremunerated female indigenous leaders, they were saying that when they went with the women to assist in terms of the communication, because the women didn't necessarily have, a high level of competence in Spanish, or for whatever reason, as you've described, you can take somebody, yeah. So these women took, this community leaders, female community leaders with them, and the doctors saying, okay, so are you related? And they would say, no, I'm just here to help, to accompany her and help. And then the doctors would say, then you have to leave the room. And they wouldn't accept that. The problem is that in developing countries, in other countries, particularly in emergency situations, it's actually quite difficult to get interpreters in situ at short notice. Or the availability of the interpreters is limited, or for whatever reason. But yeah, that basically, yes, that happens. I found that very surprising. That is the exact opposite of what happens in the global north, when, it has to be, a professional qualified interpreter, rather than a member of the family that would only accept people who are related to the patients to be present at the consultation. And again, this goes back to educating the beneficiaries of translation interpreting services and the institutions as to what the interpreter's role and remit is and where it stops.
Got it. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. Thank you for your question.
Obrigada, Vanessa. Obrigada, Raquel, pela sua resposta. Eu queria falar que a professora Silvana Santos, que está organizando esse evento junto conosco, finalmente conseguiu entrar. Ela estava com problemas técnicos e estava muito triste, mas conseguimos que ela entrasse. Eu vou passar a palavra para ela, mas antes eu tenho uma pergunta, Raquel, um pouquinho sobre o contexto brasileiro, tentando fazer um paralelo com a situação no Brasil. Então, no Brasil, hoje, nós temos, segundo alguns dados, a coexistência de 274 línguas indígenas, além de línguas de migração, de refúgio, línguas de regiões fronteiriças, línguas tradicionais. E o que nós temos ainda é um país que se enxerga monolíngue, e não é, as demandas não estão claras, mas com provedores de serviços públicos que dão acesso a direitos vitais, direitos humanos, ainda com uma visão monolíngue, né? Então, temos um povo multilíngue, uma sociedade multilíngue com instituições com atendimento monolíngue. Muito recentemente no Brasil, nós começamos a tomar os primeiros passos, apesar de sermos signatários de vários outros países, né, com direitos linguísticos. Muito recentemente, nós começamos a dar os primeiros passos em direção a leis de tradução, leis de direitos linguísticos. Temos um projeto de lei em andamento que assegura a presença de intérpretes qualificados em serviços, em prestadores de serviços como saúde, serviços legais, educacionais, de serviços sociais, mas ainda estamos em trâmite. E eu percebo que um grande problema que nós temos é essa autovisão de que nós somos um país monolíngue. Então, fazendo um paralelo com o Peru, como que você vê a conscientização desses provedores e do público em geral em relação à necessidade de intérpretes comunitários ou de serviços públicos em instituições provedoras de serviços como esse? Como que nós podemos aumentar a consciência dos servidores públicos e do público em geral, sem depender necessariamente de uma lei?
Wow. Yes, a lot, I mean, a lot to consider here. I think raising awareness, for instance, in the case of the Bawa trials, when the sort of interpreting was a novelty, it was the first time that indigenous interpreters had worked in the Court of Justice officially. I mean, of course, it may have happened before, but I mean, certainly in ancient times, yes, but in qualified interpreters registered by the government. So they were very visible, and sadly there was a lot of misconceptions about the role and what they did and their abilities. And I think in a sense, in Peru, because there is a vice ministry for intercultural affairs, they do have some platforms. I mean, sadly, they're not as well funded as they could be, but they've got platforms to basically create campaigns of awareness and distribute it to the population. They've got a very strong identity in terms of graphics and printed materials, as well as digital materials, very attractive and impactful. And I think that is actually getting to the public in terms of awareness raising. Now, obviously in Brazil, I don't know, it depends on who is invested in this kind of issue and what platforms you have at an official level. But regardless of that, I think members of civil society, NGOs, and volunteer groups can actually do a fantastic job in terms of socializing linguistic human rights.
Muitíssimo obrigada, Raquel. Eu não vou tomar mais seu tempo, queria passar a palavra para a professora Silvana, que chegou aqui. Silvana, você está aí, se puder abrir seu microfone e sua câmera, eu agradeço, por favor.
Eu estou tentando. Vocês conseguem me ouvir?
Conseguimos lhe ouvir, sim. Isso, perfeito.
Tá. Primeiramente, boa tarde, professora Raquel. Seja muito bem-vinda. Boa tarde, Mylene e todos os demais que estão aqui presentes. Quero agradecer e, ao mesmo tempo, me desculpar por esse problema tão grave de conexão que aconteceu, que me impediu de chegar mais cedo. Eu tenho acompanhado o trabalho da professora Raquel há alguns anos já e sou profunda admiradora nessa empreitada de pesquisa, de atuação profissional em torno dos direitos linguísticos das comunidades indígenas, especialmente no Peru. E a minha pergunta, ela é uma pergunta dupla, em duas direções. A primeira delas é, na sua opinião, como que a gente pode promover um espaço maior dentro dos estudos da interpretação no âmbito acadêmico, para que mais e mais pesquisas possam tratar da interpretação de línguas indígenas. Esse é um primeiro ponto. E um segundo ponto, como, talvez até isso já tenha sido tocado na palestra, mas como que a gente pode fazer medidas e ações para que o judiciário entenda que essas expectativas culturais são importantes e devem compor a cena de acesso e garantia dos direitos linguísticos. Muito obrigada. E, mais uma vez, só quero parabenizar pela oportunidade de a gente ter você conosco no programa de pós-graduação em estudos da tradução, PGET, em parceria com a I2B, a Cátedra Unesco, e agradecer aos intérpretes que estão aqui nesse momento, me permitindo que tenhamos esse momento com você.
Many thanks. Muito obrigada, Silvana. Yes, I mean, you raised very interesting points in terms of how we socialize this information. And I mean, obviously, public awareness campaigns can have a trickle-down effect, basically. So it is, you know, there is a lot of linguistic activism online in, you know, all over South America, Central America, and Mexico in particular as well. There is a lot of linguistic activism. And those are, you know, good starts. I mean, maybe they're not focusing on translation and interpreting, but it is a good way of, and this is very important for Indigenous people, certainly the ones that we worked with, Rosling, Luis, and I, they always mention visibility and visibilizing my languages, visibilizing my culture through translation and interpreting or whatever. But yeah, I think, you know, younger people may have the tools basically and the know-how in through social networks and groups and how they actually disseminate information and make themselves heard. I think that's a good start, but of course, you know, it depends on the policy. It depends on policy planning, and it depends on policy implementation. It depends on our understandings of different legal systems. So I think, you know, state interventions are also necessary, as long as they are for the good, rather than to, you know, fuel the flames of discord or whatever. But if they are, you know, showing solidarity or encouraging solidarity between all the, you know, different ethnic groups in Brazil, great. But as I said, linguistic activism is, as you know, Gilvan, is a big area of research as well. And, you know, I think, yeah, that can certainly pave the way forward.
Muito obrigada.
Muito obrigada, professora Raquel. Obrigada, Silvana. Feliz de vê-la aqui. Temos lugar para mais uma pergunta? Espaço? Ok, Raquel.
Okay.
Ok. Bom, Raquel, eu queria agradecê-la novamente por essa fantástica palestra. Muitas informações, com certeza teremos reflexões pós-palestras, né? E aí, quem sabe, enviaremos para você, se você nos permitir. Queria agradecer o seu esforço, que mesmo estando gripada, tá aí com a garganta ruim, né? Fez esse esforço de estar falando aqui por 1h30. Então, eu não vou tomar mais o seu tempo, caso a professora Silvana queira falar mais alguma coisa, mas queria falar que foi um grande prazer que, quando você quiser vir a Florianópolis no nosso programa de pós-graduação, seria um prazer recebê-la, estendo os convites do professor Gilvan fez anteriormente. Ia ser um grande prazer fazer algum tipo de parceria, com pesquisa, com projetos, enfim, estamos abertas a isso. Muitíssimo obrigada, espero que a senhora melhore em breve e que a gente possa se ver novamente também, numa próxima e
Thank
breve
you.
oportunidade.
Thank you very much. You've been very, very kind, because the honor and the pleasure is all mine. It's been great having this opportunity to discuss things with you and seeing some people whose names I recognize from research, even though we haven't had the opportunity to meet. But yes, thank you to the organizers for inviting me. And thank you to the interpreters who have been working really hard and very effectively. And yes, if I find myself in Brazil, definitely, you know, it would be an absolute treat to meet you all in person. So
Yes.
take care. Yes, thank you very much for bearing with me and my croaky voice. And hopefully, you know, we can meet again. Okay?
Yes, eu que agradeço. Thank you very much, Raquel. Obrigada a todos, intérpretes, Camila, Bárbara, Fernanda, muito obrigada. Se Gabriela e Daniel quiserem abrir as câmeras, foram eles que fizeram o show nas cabines de português e inglês. Daniel e Gabriela, muito obrigada. Pessoal, tenham um ótimo dia. Assim que a gravação estiver disponibilizada, provavelmente nós colocaremos no canal da PGET. Mas eu vou começar com a professora Silvana. Silvana, você gostaria de mais algumas palavras?
Só queria também agradecer a professora Raquel por ter nos permitido assistir. Essa temática é uma temática emergente e muito importante. Nós temos total interesse em ampliar pesquisas, parcerias nacionais e internacionais que envolvam essa temática. Agradecer a equipe maravilhosa de intérpretes, tanto do par linguístico inglês-português, quanto do par linguístico libras-português. Então, agradeço a todos que estiveram aqui e que a gente tenha a oportunidade futuramente de encontrá-la em outros espaços. É isso. Até mais. Obrigada, Mylene, pela parceria, pela
Obrigada.
apresentação. A equipe de intérpretes continua aqui.
Daniel e Gabriela, eu sei que estão. Camila está. Fernanda está.
Eu pediria que a equipe ficasse um minutinho só
Só para a gente conversar rapidamente. Nós temos Fernanda, Camila, Maria Carolina é intérprete? Fernanda Queiroz? Não, né? Pessoal, queria agradecer imensamente,
Tá
Silvana.
gravando ainda? Tá gravando?
Ó, tá, eu vou ter que